A Journey Down the Yorkshire Coast by Dalesman. Photographs by A. L. Kemp. The second stage. After visiting Filey Brigg, which cost the town £250, I chat with the secretary of the local history group and hear about pirates and superstitions. I have some interesting encounters with coastguards and fishermen, and an old man recalls when whisky was 4 shillings and 6pence a bottle. It was early evening at Filey, with the tide smacking its lips against the sea wall. The sea was calm, and the waves, forming within a stone's throw of land, were not choppy and frolicsome, but majestic rollers, a quarter of a mile in length, breaking precisely in a smother of foam. Where Filey Brigg juts stubbornly from the tawny headland, geysers of white spray leaped into the mid-air. Across the broad and shallow bay, the chalk cliffs, pride of the Yorkshire coast, stood solemn and erect, with the white tongue of Flamborough Head on the horizon. The devil made Filey Brigg. If he had not grown tired of the work, the line of hard, unyielding rock would have extended across the North Sea. At one stage he carelessly dropped his hammer, and it fell into the sea. As he groped for it, his thumb and forefinger clasped a haddock, and the fish bears the marks to this day. If you are a geologist, you will not be satisfied by this explanation, but I did not inquire into the scientific reasons for Filey Brigg, for I like legends, and I have always been fascinated by the brig, which Filey Urban Council bought for £250 just 2 years ago. Emperor's Bath. Mr. George Waller, secretary of the local history group at Filey, derives great pleasure from his retirement by research into the town's past, and he told me that first mention of Filey was when the Romans had a signal station on Carnaze. Incidentally, do the coastguards who maintain watch on Carnaze today ever think of their predecessors over 1500 years ago who manned a high square tower and served an Italian emperor? At the back of Filey's Brigg is a cave still called Emperor's Bath. Constantine bathed there, and if the weather was anything like that on the day of my visit, he would have enjoyed himself. Perhaps he too heard the legend about the devil and the brig. Mr. Waller said that Filey Bay had seen tremendous activity through the centuries, with fishermen sailing to and from their work and ships taking shelter from the storms. One complaint about the bay in 1637 was that ships were frequently wrecked because there was no harbour. On such occasions, the folk of the village made full use of the opportunity to augment their small incomes by looting. Harbour Company. The lack of a harbour crippled Filey's development, though a harbour company was formed in 1876, on which high hopes were pinned. It had a capital of £50,000, held its first ordinary meeting 2 years later, increased the capital to £100,000, had a bill through Parliament, and then eventually fizzled out. The company was wound up in 1883. That was the year a harbour would have been very valuable. A big gale struck the fishing fleet, and 8 men were drowned, leaving 7 widows and 24 young children. Pirates came into Filey Bay, running cargoes of loot ashore and taking aboard supplies for their next journey. It was even said, Mr. Waller told me, that in 1578 3 pirates were supplied with food and stores by 2 officials of the Lord High Admiral of England, who were stationed at Filey. In wartime, 17th century in particular, enemy privateers were often in the bay, chasing vessels that had not been able to join one of the coastal convoys, which sometimes sheltered here. Mr. Waller had been tracking down many of the old superstitions that clustered round Filey down the years. The people were so superstitious they would have nothing to do with religion, and in 1806, when some preachers came from Bridlington, the people would not listen. They acted, pelting the poor men with plaice and dried skate, which was so hard that blood began to flow. Today there are 6 places of worship. The Bridlington men, who were so badly treated, gave up godless Filey, and it was left to John Oxtoby to introduce Christianity. He said that sooner than give the place up, he would live on cord tatties and sleep on a board. He did not have to do it for too long. Funeral custom. Christianity did not completely smother superstition. Within living memory, a fisherman baiting a line would stop work at once on hearing a pig mentioned. If anyone went on board a yawl with a pin stuck in his coat, he had to throw it overboard immediately. There was an old Filey woman who had a grocer's shop and would not sell any eggs after sunset. Further up the coast at Whitby, it was considered unlucky to wind a ball of wool after sunset. If a fisherman or woman died at Filey, all the relatives would immediately pull down the blinds of their windows, and if it happened in Queen Street, this meant practically the lot. On funeral day, the coffin was brought out of the place in the presence of the relatives and set on trestles. Then the leader of a singing party would start a hymn. A prayer would be offered for the soul of the deceased, and a procession commenced to church, with singing all the way. If a man had died, the coffin was carried by relays of fishermen, who held white slings which passed underneath, and women were the bearers if a woman had died. One old fisherman said he would sooner go to a burying than a wedding, because he always had a good sing and a good ham tea. Sundays of Lent. Mr. Waller chanted the names used locally for the Sundays of Lent: Tid, Mid, Midray, Carlin, Palm, and Easter Day. There is a legend attached to Carlin Sunday. A ship came ashore southern north of Filey, and local men rescued the captain and his crew, giving them 2 bags of peas. They didn't know what to do with them, recounted Mr. Waller, so they fried them in fat, and it's been called Carlin Sunday ever since. If you are interested in statistics, Mr. Waller will tell you that in 1866 there were 64 cobbles, 17 herring cobbles, and 34 yawls, all sailing vessels manned by Filey men, but the coming of steam affected the trade, and in 1896 the number had dropped to 32 cobbles, 12 herring cobbles, and 24 yawls. Today there are no yawls, no herring cobbles, and only 8 to 10 cobbles. The fishermen of the old yawl days had a harder life than their successors in the industry today. Sail and oar were the only means of propulsion. Many a time there was a flat calm, and they had to launch their boat and rig a towing line to the yawl, then start rowing, possibly for several miles. If a gale was blowing from the wrong quarter, they had to tack and sail a great distance to get to harbour. In 1869, 31 yawls sailed for the fishing grounds in fine weather. They had just lowered their nets into the water when it started to blow. By daylight next day, it was blowing a gale. The men thought they would never reach harbour, but providentially they reached home safely. Coastguards Room. Station Officer A. Lawton, who has been in the Coastguard service for 2 decades, was busy in a tidy little room overlooking the bay. We had been chatting for a few minutes when he leapt to the door and called out to 2 men wearing blue jerseys who were enjoying a quiet walk along the promenade. I was introduced to Laffy Jenkinson. We nearly all have nicknames here. And his friend, William Sayers. In a town where there were few surnames among the fisherfolk, it was essential to have nicknames to distinguish one person from another, and Laffy said that among the Jenkinsons were Titch, Tint, Bonzo, and Buggins. The Camishers had Chicken, Tutor, Miser. Other nicknames bestowed on the hunters, main prizes, and sayers included Ginger, Wilt, Scrat, Physic. Reckon we Jenkinsons go back to the Vikings, said Laffy, and several other local families have good claims to this distinction as well. Laffy's name is inseparably linked with salmon, the season for which begins about the middle of May and ends with October. Nets, which are 320 yards long, are in use, weighted at the bottom with small lead pellets and corked at the top. There's been very poor fishing these last few years, he said. We're hoping for better this year. Biggest salmon I've taken out weighed about 42 pounds. but it was a lot of years ago. I had a fish weighing 2 ton last year. Aye, it was a basking shark, and it did me 10 quid's worth of damage. Sold it to the fish meal factory at Hull for £3.15 shilling. Laffy's mate. I discovered that a new salmon net costs not much under £200, and a licence for fishing costs £5. Sometimes you'll go out for a week and catch nothing. Next you might pick up 15 in a day. It's a chancy business. Laffy's mate is his uncle, who is 69 years old. Both his father and grandfather went after salmon. He operates with a small salmon cobble, Scarborough built, powered by lug sail and oars. It is 22.5 feet long, 5 feet 9 inches in the beam, and weighs about 1.25 tons. Work goes on at the edge of the beach. He has been fishing for nearly half a century, and his first sea experiences were gained on a yawl, when he was paid 7 shillings a week and found his own food. The boat was at sea for a week at a time, dipping its lines at Dogger Bank. He remembers the bitter experiences of 1930, when a southeasterly gale blew up and most of the cobbles at Filey were lost. It was an August gale and came on during the night. The boats were knocked against the rocks and others went floating out to sea. Not many were saved. Old George Appleby kept 3 horses, which were used to drag the cobbles from the water to firm land. A tractor is used today. I heard that 3 boat building firms once operated in Filey. They were owned by William Cambridge, John Chapman and William and Richard Kappelman. Now there is not one along the immediate coastline. Wedding race. Laffy warmed to his tale-telling. After a couple got married, he said, the bride and bridegroom would hold a silk neckerchief between them, and there was a race for it. There might be 10 or 15 men running, and some of them had a real collection of them. Ross Jenkinson was one of the best. Another wedding custom was the throwing of a plate of wedding cake over the bride's head. The plate broke when it hit the ground on the other side, and the more pieces there were, the more luck there would be. Mr. Sayers has done a great deal of deep-sea fishing, and his career spans 54 years. From yawls, he graduated to steam drifters. Limpets, or flithers, were collected by the women as bait for the yawls when they went to Dogger Bank after haddock. These limpets were kept in kits, each holding 8 or 10 stone. Laffy said that his mother used to go to Cloughton gathering limpets before the railway was built, and she reckoned on earning 5 shillings a tide. There was always use at Filey for a table knife which broke, for the stump was sharpened, the handle padded, and it was employed removing the limpets from rocks. Scaning knife. We were joined by another coastguard, Mr. H. Skelton, and he produced 3 curious links with the days of which we are speaking. There was a scaning knife, over a century old, used for opening mussels or limpets. It had been made by the local blacksmith and had a shaft of ash. There was a picking or flither knife, of which I had just heard. Half the paths down the cliffs were made by women on their way to collect flithers, someone said. And the third exhibit was a beating needle for net repairing, fashioned from part of a bullock rib. It was as beautiful as antique, an echo of the days before wood or plastic became the fashion for this type of instrument. Before it became dark, I glanced out of the windows at Carnaze and made out the sturdy form of the lookout. The evening was calm, and the sky promised another spell of good weather. But it is not always so. When the wind comes from the east, the waves mount the tall cliffs, and the eyes of the coastguards are rimmed with fatigue and the strain of looking seawards against the spray. Occasionally, 2 green star maroons race skywards and flash a warning across the sky. Then the lifeboatmen who operate under the Royal National Lifeboat Institution tumble from their beds, hurriedly dress and race to the boathouse. If a white star hangs over Filey, the life-saving equipment is needed, and the local LSA company, 20 men in all, report for duty. Great storm. There was an anxious time when January 1953 came to a close with the great storm. Winds of 105 knots were recorded at Flamborough Head, and many boats were damaged. The lookout post, 180 feet above the sea, was perpetually drenched by spray, and waves roared over High Nab, which is 60 feet high. Considerable damage was done to the holiday resorts, and Filey did not escape, but fortunately the 60-year-old sea wall stayed put throughout most of its length. It was built to turn a wave back onto its successor, and it did this job well. Let Laffy Hutchinson bring the conversation in the coastguard duty room to a close. Fishing hereabouts is on the decline. Young lads won't have it. There used to be 150 fishermen from Filey setting off on a Monday morning to go to Scarborough and man the fishing boats. There won't be above 30 now, and they aren't getting any younger, I can tell you. Note, I think that should read Laffy Jenkinson, not Laffy Hutchinson. Wander down Queen Street and you meet these fishermen and their families. But Filey today is considerably larger than Queen Street, and as a holiday resort it is growing in popularity, offering a half-moon shape of golden sands for the pleasure of visitors. A tanner's worth. An old man I met near the sea shook his head sadly and surveyed changing times. He remembered when fishing was more important in the local economy than catering for visitors, though he was pleased to see a bit of life about in the summertime. Let me tell you this, mister, he said. You could buy haddock anywhere from 10 shillings to £1 a box. About 8 stone to each box. I've known cod sold at £1 a score, crabs at 9p and 1 shilling a score, and lobsters 6p and 9p apiece. I've heard my father say he sold them for 4p apiece, and the way the fisherwomen had to work was terrible. But look at the credit side for a minute. Pubs were open from 6 in the morning to 11 at night, and if you put a tanner on the bar counter, you could have a pint of beer, ounce of bacca, box of matches, and a clay pipe. Aye, and clay pipe was promptly put into the beer, so it was tanned. Leaving him with his memories of beer at 2.5p a pint and whisky at 4 shillings 6p a bottle, I had my last look at Filey before heading to the highest cliffs on the Yorkshire coast, where I knew I would meet the seabirds. Continued next month. Let's hope we find the second part.